The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 2 of this 7-day sesshin, the very first sesshin in 2020 in January at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to share a little bit more from a very interesting book that I've just come across. It is called No Self, No Problem: How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. And the author is Chris Niebauer, PhD, who is a professor as near as can be discerned at a university, small university in Pennsylvania. And he has been researching first in grad school and also as he's teaching as well, the whole interface between what neuropsychology is beginning to uncover in comparison to what the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago. Not only the Buddha, but also these same truths are expressed in the Tao Te Ching, which is the Taoist, I guess you could call it Bible, and also in Advaita Vedanta of Hinduism. There is a great wide swath of understanding in the East that the neuropsychologists in the West are just finally catching up with, and practicing Buddhists have been taught for millennia. And I'd like to share in particular parts of this chapter, the first chapter, which is entitled Meet the Interpreter, an Accidental Discovery. Meet the Interpreter, an Accidental Discovery. And the whole premise of this chapter, and he cites research that supports it, is that our brain is set up physiologically, I guess you could say, to talk to itself, to interpret circumstances. And we've known this for a long time in terms of conditioning, how a person can have certain experiences in their life, and they are conditioned to assume certain things about themselves, about the world, about other people as a result. Whether people are friendly and kind, or whether they're dangerous and malevolent, whether a particular part of a town or a country or a building, a particular environment is dangerous or not. Now, of course, a certain amount of this is reality, but what happens is when we are born, we are not exactly a clean slate, because we come in, if you want to speak of past life experience, which the energy of which is part of the energy that comes in this little body that is born. And everything that happens to this body, including before it's born, when this little body is in its mother's belly, the process of the birth, and what happens after that. I think here of the intense experience these little preemies receive when they're in the NICU, the neonatal ICU in hospitals, in attempts to keep them alive so that they can grow and thrive. And many of them do, and many of them don't. And there's a sort of a cutoff point as to when it's assumed that an infant is developed enough to be able to survive and become an adult eventually, or whether it's simply too early in the developmental spectrum for it to happen. And of course, modern medicine has got many, many ways to help it move in the positive direction. I know that a mother can be given steroid shots if she's in danger of miscarrying, and it may well keep the child longer, but what it does is mature the infant faster, so that if it is still born prematurely, it has a better chance of survival. The lungs will have developed enough, and so on and so forth. There are downsides to this process, by the way. There are side effects, known side effects. At any rate, children are born, and they may or may not receive positive reinforcement after that. They may be born into a family that's addicted, or a family that's extremely mature or violent, and their perception of the world will be based on their experiences in that family. We would all hope that babies would be born into loving, caring, mature, nurturing parents. But unfortunately, most parents kind of have to learn on the job. They may get it a little bit better down when they come to the second or third or fourth or fifth or 20th child, but the first child is the learning experiments. And this registers in what we know as conditioning. But let's see what Chris Niebauer has to say about this. In the 1960s, Dr. Michael Gazzaniga was part of a group that performed some of the most interesting and experimental brain surgeries in history. Not only did these experiments reveal how the left and right sides of the brain are responsible for different functions, they also inadvertently laid the groundwork for the idea that the self doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. Gazzaniga himself would be more blunt about the topic later as he began his 1998 book, The Left Brain Interpreter, with a chapter titled The Fictional Self. The Fictional Self. And there's a little bit of a caveat with the results of these surgeries that are being cited here. And let me preface this by saying that there is a woman, a Canadian woman, I believe, or at least she lives in Canada, who was born with only one hemisphere. In other words, with half a brain. And it was quite difficult for her to function in life. She couldn't tell time. She had no clues as to where her body was in space. There were other deficits as well. However, she was intrepid, and she taught herself, for example, how to tell time, looking at a clock with hands. It was a long and laborious process, but she did train her brain, what brain she had, to be able to recognize time based on where the hands were on the clock. And she taught herself a great deal other things. It was amazing what she was able to do in terms of training her own brain. And in fact, she ended up with a PhD and established an institute, I think it's in Toronto, that works with people who have dyslexia and other disabilities, that she is able to teach them how to overcome. So it does seem possible that though if a person has two hemispheres, which is the normal brain, that they would sort of subdivide the responsibilities. And so the left brain would be responsible for speech. But let's continue here with Dr. Gazzaniga's experiments. There's a comment also by our professor. Is it possible that neuroscience and psychology, through the work of Gazzaniga and others, have now unwittingly proven what these Eastern philosophical traditions started centuries ago? As we endeavor to answer this question, I will provide you with exercises so that you can experience for yourself whether or not these findings are true. The good news is that, unlike for Gazzaniga's patients, no brain surgery will be required. And of course, we are already working in that direction through our Zen practice. Before we move on, it is important to have a basic understanding of how the brain works and the revolutionary findings of Gazzaniga. To begin, the most interesting aspect of the brain is also one of the most obvious. The brain has two mirror halves connected by a large set of fibers called the corpus callosum. In the 1960s, in research undertaken to try to mitigate severe epilepsy, these 800 million nerve fibers were severed, the central thesis being that seizure activity crossed from one side of the brain to the other over the corpus callosum, increasingly the severity of seizures. Doctors Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga believed that by cutting the bridge between the two sides of the brain, seizures would be easier to control. And they were correct, and Sperry would win the Nobel Prize in 1981 for this work. While each side of the brain specializes in certain types of tasks, both sides are usually in continuous communication. When this connection is disrupted, however, it became possible to study the job of each side of the brain in isolation. Now, that is to study brains that were already connected and already interacting left to right brain, which is very different from the woman who was born only with half a brain but managed to teach her brain how to function as a two-lobed brain. For example, until the connection was disrupted, scientists relied on either brain damage or indirect methods to test for differences between the left and right brain. However, with the sides disconnected in these epileptic patients, scientists could test each on its own and gain insight into the functional differences between the left and right sides of the brain. These patients were referred to as split brain patients. To understand this research, it's also important to know that the body is cross-wired. That is, all the input and output from the right half of the body crosses over and is processed by the left brain and vice versa. This crossover is also true for vision, so that the left half of what we see goes to the right side of the brain and vice versa. Again, this only became obvious in the split brain patients. Research with these subjects led to one of the most important discoveries about the left side of the brain, one that has yet to be fully appreciated by modern psychology or the general public. Gazzaniga determined that the left side of the brain created explanations and reasons to help make sense of what was coming on. And this is really important. The left side of the brain created explanations and reasons to help make sense of what was going on. And whether it's the left brain or the right brain or both sides of the brain, this is an important aspect, both of our humanity and our assumption of a separate self. In order to function in this world, we have to learn certain things. We have to learn how to function in society. And one of the challenges of children who are born on the autism spectrum is that they appear to lack certain ways of understanding the motives, the ways of interaction of other people. And so they're kind of like living in a foreign land where they don't quite know the language, and therefore they don't quite know how to function easily, harmoniously in society. It reminds me a little bit of when I was in Japan, living at Sogenji, and I had gone into town on the bus for some errand or other, and took the bus back that was standing at the bus station. Let me back up a minute. In Japan, there are central bus stations. And in fact, Japan has got a wonderful transportation system. Everything interlinks, and there's basically very little time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, of waiting between transfers, between buses, between boats, between trains, between airplanes, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a little bit more between the airplanes, but you can get on a bus in Okayama and get to the airport in Osaka and get on a train to go somewhere else, or you get to some other place and you get on a different manner of transportation, go to somewhere else, and it's all very quick. When we went to visit Shirobanan's, no, not Shirobanan, Dokyo Etan's little temple, far, far away from Okayama in Japan, we took a train first to go to his son, I guess you'd call it that, his Dharma son's temple, that would be Hakuin. And then we took another train and another train and another train. And each of these trains we had to wait very little time for. In fact, the one that connected in the Tokyo suburbs, we had to almost dash to get at it. So I would go into town and on the bus, and the bus station in Okayama was not enormous, and there were various different stalls, 6 or 8 of them, I believe, for the different bus routes. And I always knew to get on the bus at a particular one of those stalls, and it served me well until this one time. And it turns out that there were 3 different routes that used that same stall. And since at the time I couldn't read kanji, I didn't know that the bus I was getting onto was going to skirt around where I needed to get off, and I would not be able to get off where I needed to get off to go back to Sogenji. And I didn't realize this until suddenly it made a right turn and started heading up a mountain, far from where I needed to go. This is the kind of thing that can happen when people don't have an understanding of the full range of language, of culture, of what they need to know. You can imagine that very quickly I learned to read the kanji for the bus route that went right past Sogenji. So there is a value to this ability in our minds to analyze, to predict, to assume, but there's a downside too. And let's talk about this with these studies. Gazzaniga determined that the left side of the brain created explanations and reasons to help make sense of what was going on. The left brain acted as an interpreter for reality. Furthermore, and this is important, Gazzaniga found that this interpreter was often completely and totally wrong. This finding should have rocked the world, but most people haven't heard of it. To gain a better understanding of how the split brain works, let's look at some of these studies and these findings in more detail. In one of Gazzaniga's early studies, a split brain patient had a picture of a chicken's foot presented to the left brain only, in other words, from his right side. I guess they had the other left eye covered up or something. Doesn't explain how they managed this, but it would be pretty simple to do so. So this picture of the chicken's foot was presented to the left brain only, and a picture of a snow scene was shown to the right brain only. So he had 2 different pictures, one for his right eye and one for his left eye. Then the patient had several pictures shown to both sides of the brain simultaneously and was asked to pick which one was the most related to the original images they were shown. Each side of the brain performed perfectly. The right brain, using the left hand, pointed to a picture of a snow shovel, whereas the left brain, using the right hand, pointed to a picture of a chicken. Then things got more interesting. The experimental asked the patient a simple question. Why is your left hand pointing to a snow shovel? Keep in mind, when the experimenter was talking to the split-brain patient, he was talking only to the patient's left brain, since the left brain controls speech. The left brain should have said, I haven't talked to the right brain in a long time. I don't know why it does what it does with the left hand, but it didn't. Without hesitation, the left brain said, oh, that's simple. The chicken foot goes for the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop. The patient stated this with absolute confidence. Here is what is most important about this talking left side of the brain. It easily came up with a plausible and coherent, but completely wrong, explanation based on the evidence it had available. In another example, researchers presented the word walk to a patient's right brain only. The patient immediately responded to the request and stood up and started to leave the van in which the testing was taking place. When the patient's left brain, the language side, was asked why he got up to walk again, the interpreter came up with a plausible but completely incorrect explanation. I'm going into the house to get a Coke. In another exercise, the word laugh was presented to the right brain, and the patient complied. When asked why she was laughing, her left brain responding by cracking a joke. You guys come up and test us each month. What a way to make a living. Remember, the correct answer here would have been, I laughed because you asked me to. Think about the significance of this for a moment. The left brain was simply making up interpretations or stories for events that were happening in a way that made sense to that side of the brain. A shovel is needed for a chicken coop, or as if it had directed the action. I got up because I needed a drink, or I laughed at my own joke. Neither of these explanations was true, but that was unimportant to the interpretive mind, which was convinced that its explanations were the correct ones. Dr. V.S. Ramachandran, one of the most innovative neuroscientists of the 20th century, shared a theory of the left brain that is very similar to Gazzaniga's. After conducting his own experiments, Ramachandran found that the left brain's role is one of beliefs and interpretation, and that it had little regard for reality in making up its interpretations. Not on purpose, I'm sure. For instance, Ramachandran's experiments included subjects whose right brain was severely damaged, leaving the left side of the body paralyzed. With a level of damage to the right brain, the left brain is effectively running the show. When Ramachandran asked one affected subject if she could move her paralyzed left hand, she replied, yes, it's not paralyzed. Another one of Ramachandran's subjects claimed that her paralyzed left arm was actually stronger than her right, and that she could lift a large table an inch and a half off the ground with it. Others use rationalization as an explanation for the paralysis. They would say things like, I don't want to move my arm, it hurts. Or, the medical students have been prodding me all day and I don't want to move it right now. As in the studies of Gazzaniga, the left brain was simply making up a story about reality without any regard for the truth. Over the last 40 years, several additional studies have shown that the left side of the brain excels at creating an explanation for what's going on, even if it isn't correct. The truth is that your left brain has been interpreting reality for your whole life. And if you are like most people, you've never understood the full implications of this. And this is why, as we said yesterday in Teisho as well, it is so important to take the practice beyond the level of speech. Because the left brain speech center, as we said at the very beginning, talks to itself. And we have a constant stream of chatter going on in our brains, all about lots of different things, actually. We can have fragments of songs, we can have comments, inner comments. Often we will walk down the street or go into a room and immediately we are commenting to ourselves about the situation there. all of which is up for question as to veracity. Yet if we go beyond speech, there's a deeper level of understanding, a deeper level of knowing, really a knowing with a capital N, a capital K, that is, as near as I've been able to experience, absolutely correct. It can be trusted. In order to access that, we have to let go of thought, and in order to let go of thought, we have to sort of face a level of anxiety around that, initially at least. Once we've gotten through that phase of accepting the experience of anxiety, it no longer has any potency for us. And we're no longer frightened of going beyond speech, allowing ourselves to be inwardly silent, allowing ourselves to be able to search beyond words. Sure, initially it's going to feel like we're going to disappear. As Descartes so famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He may not have realized how close to the truth he was. The I that he's speaking of being an artificial self-image. And it's the self-image and all its misdirection, it's all its misinterpretation that brings us grief. Sure, it has its role, and we're born with it. So we may as well learn to work with it, which means not necessarily taking it at face value. Communication is important. Communication also has a lot of stumbling blocks, a lot of challenges, and is often prone to miscommunication because, again, the interpreter. We say something to somebody and they interpret it in a certain way. They interpret our meaning according to their assumptions. And then they respond, and we interpret that according to our own assumptions, our own history. It's amazing that there aren't more challenges in life. There certainly are enough already. But there is this deeper place that we sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here in this Zendo for 7 days and working for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, reaching deep within, beyond those words, to find the truth. So now you know why, I hope, it's important to go beyond words in your practice. And we certainly have the practice to do it. Susokan is incredibly effective with this. One of the things that was discovered in experiments was that the interpreter goes offline when we extend the out-breath. It can't multitask. And if we are fully present with the experience of extending the out-breath far out, then we reach a place of greater clarity, of some distance from the automatic assumptions that we carry with us. And there is incredible potential there for liberation, for realization of a deeper truth, one with a capital T, that is always true. So go for it. You will find it most worthwhile. The most important thing a human being can do in this very short life. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.